French Colonization of Algeria by Mariana, Sarah, Jacob, and Will.
6.1 Rationales of Imperialism. So the quote is, "I have no doubt that we can raise on the coast of Africa a great monument to the glory of our country." It was by Alex de Tocqueville in his second letter on Algeria in 1837. This quote represents social Darwinism because they thought that they were great enough in order to take over Algeria. Alex de Tocqueville thought that they could conquer Algeria and use it to display other European countries that France had a powerful military force that could conquer countries and raise colonies. Alexis was the father of Western liberalism. He was a strong French advocate for Algerian colonization.
6.1 Rationales of Imperialism. The white man's burden was another rationale that was used, and its cultural superiority, and France deconstructed the Algerian culture in order to make it more French. By imperializing, France is advancing and helping Algerians. An example of this is Notre Dame d'Afrique, because it's this huge cathedral that the French built to impose their superiority on the Algerians, and it was completed in 1872 after 14 years of construction. We have a primary source quote from Frederick Ober, and it says, "In one word, as to situation, as to composition, as to surroundings, Algiers is beautiful. Its beauty is of the Oriental type, with an intrusion from France. The French structures, which are mainly along the quays and in the lower part of town, are of themselves fine and even grand."
This illustration depicts the village of Algiers, the capital of Algeria, being blockaded by the French Navy in 1830. These efforts didn't have much effect due to unrest in the native Muslim population. This is an example of social Darwinism because France blockaded the city after the fly whisk incident. France thought their navy was powerful enough to completely block Algeria to take it over.
This is a French political cartoon depicting a French woman bringing wealth to the Moroccan natives. It has a caption saying, "France will be able to freely bring Morocco civilization, wealth, and peace." It shows white man's burden because the French believed that they were bringing civilization to the Moroccan people.
6.2 State expansion from 1750 to 1900. France conquered Algeria through military conquest. An example of this is in 1827 when France blockaded Algeria for 3 years because of the fly whisk incident, where the last Algerian ruler hit a French consul with a whisk 3 times. To the right is a map that shows the military conquest over time, and it can be seen that Algeria was conquered in about 1830, and the last of this military conquest was about in 1960. So a French soldier in Algeria named Lucien de Montenac wrote in 1843, "All populations which do not accept our conditions must be despoiled. Everything must be seized, devastated, without age or sex distinction." Later on, he went on to say, "We must do war against Arabs, kill all men over the age of 15, take all their women and children, load them onto naval vessels."
6.3 is the indigenous responses to state building. And these anti-French political cartoons were made to showcase the murder of Algerians during French invasions. The cartoon on the right depicts Algerian soldiers as strong and superior to the French, and make the French attempt to chain them up as unsuccessful. And the cartoon to the left illustrates how France and the United States were allied in the colonization of Algeria, and it shows Algerians being murdered in their homeland in the name of colonization. And we can see that the indigenous peoples were very angry about the colonization because they decided to go out and make these anti-French political cartoons.
6.3 Indigenous responses to state building. Unite your efforts in order to improve our lot, for the suppression of the Code d'Indigène, for the freedom of the press and assembly, for the equality of military service, for the freedom of immigration, against the sending of native troops to foreign lands, against the war in Morocco. Fight against French imperialism for this. Join en masse l'Étoile Nord-Africaine. Long live the independence of Algeria. This is an excerpt talking about the Indigenous Code of 1865. It stated that all Algerians, specifically Muslims, were not considered true citizens of France. This is also an example that is like Haiti in the aspect that it is a colony of France, and the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen does not apply to French colonies. Muslims were expected to renounce their religion in order to be granted French citizenship. These religions and racial inequalities were major factors that drove Algerian War, which gained Algerian independence from France.
The indigena reached into every cranny of the Muslims' majority life. Under its 27 provisions, Muslims were controlled by legislation rights down to requiring permission to go on pilgrimage. They could be imprisoned for making rude remarks about French authority. This is a quote by Martin Evans showing how the French controlled every aspect of the Muslims' life.
6.3 The Mokrani Revolt. This revolt was when the group of rebels in Algeria was triggered by Khmer extension of colonial authority to previously self-governing reserves and the abrogation of commitments made by military government, the scarcity of grain, and other such grievances. The Muslim population was blamed for the incident, and the French took strict measures to punish them taking more tribal land. The revolt and punishment directly towards the Muslim population shows anti-colonial backlash and revolt over questions over Khmer's power in Algeria, when he took over what had previously been Algerian rule, as well as discontent with his rule and food shortages. To the right is an illustration of a French attack on the city of Bourgi-bu-Ari something, about 148 miles east of Algiers. It was created by Leon Morel in 1871.
6.4 is global economic development, and Algeria's capital city of Algiers is located on the northwest coast of Africa, directly on the Mediterranean Sea. And the prime location of Algiers not only allowed for France to easily enforce a naval blockade, but also to acquire natural resources once they colonized the area. And one natural resource that Algeria had was fertile land, which was very appealing to the French for colonization efforts because they were going to become a producer of cash crops and export them back to mainland France. And the most important export was wine, because the vineyards in France were destroyed, and the exportation from Algeria replaced all of the lost wine. And to the right, there's a map showing the French colonization of Algeria and Algiers' capital city location on the coast. And there's also a quote from a French author from 1846, and it reads, "All of the land situated between Carthage and the Pillars of Hercules is of an extreme fertility."
6.4 Global Economic Development. In 1863, a severe phylloxera epidemic struck southern French vines. As a consequence, French wine production declined by about 70% in 1870s and 1880s. About 50,000 French households were Pierre Noires, many of which were wine holders left to Algeria between 1871 and 1900. This increased the skill within Algeria in the making of wine. Algeria exported twice as much wine as the other three major exporters at the time: France, Italy, and Spain combined. The wine that was made in Algeria was traded by ship along the Mediterranean from 1860 to 1970. Mediterranean wine trade represented 80% to more than 90% of global wine trade. The total wine planted area in Algeria reached 400,000 hectares. In Algeria, there was free trade with France, meaning exporting wine was not taxed. This boosted the wine economy. By the By the 1890s, French settlers did not need to import wine from France anymore, but consumed Algerian wine instead.
This is an 1858 map of immigration showing where everybody was immigrating, and there is a thin blue line between France and Morocco showing all the people who worked in vineyards moving to Algeria to oversee wine production there.
6.4 Global Economic Development. Wine production was only possible in northern coastal regions, specifically the Haute Plateau. Much of the wine that was produced was red wine, and to combat the high temperatures, which were not good for vineyards, the innovation of refrigeration or cold fermentation allowed for large commercial winemaking. Competitors like Italy and Spain started taking over the wine industry. So France started promoting Algerian wine. It can be seen in this table that as time went on, the production of wine in Algeria increased.
6.5 is economic imperialism, and these three charts show levels of GDP, which stands for gross domestic product. And France was exploiting Algeria's resources for their own benefit and Algerian detriment. France's per capita GDP from 1820 to 1913, which is when they acquired Algeria, grew by 1.13 each year. And Algerian GDP in 2001, which is the only data point after their independence, was 6.2 times increase. And this shows that France was going to stifle the Algerian economic growth in favor of their own.
6.6 Causes of migration in an interconnected world. Pre-migration. Before the French migrated into Algeria, the country is known for pirates who attacked Christian ships. Algeria was given the name Barbary Coast because it was so corrupt. Transportation. The French chose the quickest route by sailing to Algeria before initiating a naval blockade. The French Navy was very strong and well equipped for colonization. Reasons for migration. The French were migrating to Algeria to seek cultivable land and its prime location on the African coast, on the Mediterranean coast. Many migrated in order to escape the phylloxera epidemic, which struck many of their vineyards. Algeria's location allowed the French to establish safe Mediterranean trade relations that they couldn't have before because of pirates and thieves. The French may have also been influenced by social Darwinism, and they felt they were meant to conquer Algeria's large Muslim population because they were stronger.
So the effects of this migration was that only primary education was available to Algerians, and the low education levels led to unemployment, which hurt many Muslims living in France. And most Algerians didn't like the takeover of the French, so they fought back, and due to these revolts, land was taken from them, and their families were simply forced to leave. The country had very fertile lands, which they forced natives from, and people from all over Europe, mainly Spain and France, came over in seek of opportunity due to these fertile lands. And after gaining independence in 1962, Algeria banned its citizens from migrating to France. This has now been lifted, and a large part of France's population is of Algerian descent. Nationalistic groups emerged as people disliked the rule of the French, and they realized violent means were necessary for protesting. And after migration, many Algerians went back to France after gaining independence because of economic opportunity. And 200,000 Algerians fought for France during World War I, and a third of male Algerians between 20 and 40 fought in World War I for France.
6.8 Causation in Imperial Age. The 18th century marked the beginning of intense revolution and rebellion, resulting in new nation-states. French colonization efforts due to imperialism had widespread changes, but as nationalism increased, many of these colonies wanted to be independent, including Algeria. The Mokrani Revolt in 1871 over an extension of power and lack of grain was one of Algeria's revolutions for independence. An increase of nationalism after World War I led to more calls for independence, which started the Algerian War for Independence in November 1954, which lasted 8 years and ended in Algerian independence on July 3, 1962. The image to the right shows a devastating scene from the Mokrani Revolt in 1871.